So in effect, because the information, whether they are in detention or not, it is all what people say. I mean, you could call this an enforced disappearance. Now, what has Amnesty done? We've been working for many decades on Equatorial Guinea. What we do, our work consists on monitoring, researching the violations, and then denouncing the violations. And by doing that, we also do that through our members. We lobby countries, governments. We lobby the UN. We present our reports to the UN, submissions to the UN, and we try to recruit as many people as possible to help us to improve the situation in Equatorial Guinea. So that is what we've been doing. Have we been successful? Well, I think to some extent, yes, because Equatorial Guinea, until for many years, was an unknown country. It remains pretty unknown, but less so now. I think Amnesty has put Equatorial Guinea on the human rights map, and possibly also in the geopolitical map, and that has helped to gain allies for us and has made our work a little bit easier as well, having other people to help us, because we are Amnesty International is the only organization that has been working systematically on the country. There's no any other organization doing that work. We have contributed to the release of prisoners, and that is a great achievement and a great joy for all of us when we get our prisoners released. When we have, I think, through our work and the work of other people that work with us, we have saved lives. I am sure of that, and that is a great satisfaction. We have seen, I think, we have contributed to improving the situation a little bit. I'm not saying the situation is good, far from that. But there has been, if I look back 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, the number of arrests has diminished. The number of the torture cases has diminished as well for political prisoners, not necessarily for convicted criminals. So that it is a small thing, but it is something that's all we've got, and something that we need to cling on and to keep pushing to open the door more widely. 3 years ago, a law against torture was passed, which there is a lot of room for improvement in there. And there's a lot of improvement for there, but it is actually, the problem with the law is that it's not implemented. And I'll finish there because I am told to keep quiet for now. It is impossible to put 20 years of work into 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Ken Hurwitz, and I am the head of the anti-corruption program at the Open Society Initiative, Open Society Justice Initiative. The Open Society Justice Initiative is an operational program, which is essentially an NGO within a foundation called the Open Society Institute, which was founded by philanthropist George Soros for the purpose of building democracies whose governments are accountable to their citizens. Our mandate is to pursue law reform activities grounded in the protection of human rights and to contribute to the development of legal capacity for open societies worldwide. We work in a number of areas, including national criminal justice reform in a number of different countries, equality and citizenship, freedom of information and expression, international justice, and so on. But my program is the anti-corruption program, which is the junior sibling of the programs. We started in 2006 looking at resource-related corruption as an issue. Now, the paradox that's often noted in many cases is that those countries that are richest in natural resources, wealth, oil, diamonds, gold, often suffer the most from poverty, wars, dictatorial governance, and underdevelopment. The wealth of the country and the ability of autocrats to accumulate control of that national wealth in the state has the effect of making the state independent of the need for economic support from the people, that is to say, for tax revenues. This, in turn, heightens both the ability and the incentive of dictators to maintain political power. And such systems of control are regularly associated with lack of transparency regarding investments and revenues. This opacity acts as the mother's milk for the systematic grand corruption that is established in a system where the governing groups of a country essentially steal most of the country's wealth. In recent years, the lack of transparency in resource extraction industries has generated a large wave of activity aimed at exposing egregious abuses that result from this kind of mass corruption. Naming and shaming is essentially the kind of activity I'm referring to. In addition, there have been more constructive initiatives to develop initiatives to put a preventive light on resource extraction. And these approaches, particularly the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, have found a fair amount of success and support both from governments and from businesses. Within this context, however, the Justice Initiative anti-corruption work seeks to fill what we perceive as a gap, which is the virtual absence of accountability. To date, efforts to establish accountability in the area of resource corruption have centered on human rights violations and environmental damage associated with the extractive industries. Now, both of these are, of course, extremely important areas to address. But direct legal responses to corruption itself has remained relatively rare. This is despite the fact that spoliation often occurs independent of human rights violations and environmental abuses. And typically, spoliation underlies those broader problems where they do occur. Our program rubric is Legal Remedies for the Resource Curse, and you're all welcome to a copy of the publication with the same title in the back of the room. That notion of legal remedies expresses our mandate to fill this gap. That is, to develop tools involving litigation to sanction and ultimately deter grand corruption. We believe it is essential to include the risk of accountability into the mix of incentives for fair and transparent dealings in natural resources. And central to this is the possibility of criminal prosecution in national courts, although other criminal tribunals and even civil tribunals will play their role. The home countries of multinational extractive industry corporations and of banks that are instrumental players in the process of diverting national health can and should play a particularly key role in establishing a web of accountability. But bringing cases is complex. It involves voluminous evidence that is hard to find and difficult to understand. It's also very dangerous in many cases. It's very likely to call upon legal and financial and investigative expertise in several jurisdictions with differing legal systems. And it has to confront muscular bank secrecy regimes. In short, these cases that are high profile, high cost, and high risk are very rare, and very few organizations have been both motivated and equipped to pursue them. In our modest way, that's what we try to do. We believe that with so few cases out there actually addressing the problem of systematic grand corruption, a few well-chosen strategic successes can enhance the ability and willingness of prosecutors and courts to tackle the problem. We hope to develop new ways of understanding and applying the existing legal tools, and through practice to extend their reach and usefulness. Where possible, we will seek to undertake cases directly by serving as counsel in cases in which the initiative of commencing litigation lies with the victim or another private party who formally participates. This could be as a plaintiff in a common law civil lawsuit for money damages, or it could be as a partie civile or civil party in a civil law proceeding. Sometimes this will not be possible, however, because generally a plaintiff or a civil party, it will be required to show a specific injury particular to him or her that entitles that person to initiate and or participate in the proceeding. where everyone is a victim, as is often the case in systems of grand corruption, there may be no one who actually satisfies this particularized requirement. We also, therefore, play an important role by helping to identify and develop cases and present dossiers to prosecutors who can then pursue them, or to investigating magistrates. In the best outcome, ultimately, the lion's share of anti-corruption litigation will in fact be conducted by national law enforcement, drawing on tools of investigation and compulsion that civil society organizations do not and should not happen. Some examples of cases we have developed working with partner groups include two cases that do relate to Equatorial Guinea. While this is not the proper forum to go into detailed specifics of either of these cases, which are in litigation, I will say a little bit about each. The first case is a money laundering case that we have developed working with the Spanish NGO Asociación por Derechos Humanos de España, the Spanish Association for Human Rights, and other partners. We filed this case in October 2008 in the Audiencia Nacional in Madrid. The case grows out of a series of 16 wire transfers made from the official Equatorial Guinea oil revenue account at Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C., that were uncovered by a U.S. Senate investigating committee in 2004. Investigators found that between June 2000 and December 2003, more than $26 million was transferred into a Spanish bank account owned by a corporation believed by investigators to be owned by the President of Equatorial Guinea or close associates of his. Sole signatories on the government's oil revenue account at Riggs were the President plus one of either his son or his nephew. The case was filed, and a investigating magistrate undertook to accept the case, and it is now awaiting determination of competence by the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor in Madrid. The other case, also filed on behalf of the APDH, was in the African Commission on Human and People's Rights in October 2007. It was brought under Article 21 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which establishes all peoples shall freely dispose of their wealth and natural resources. In case of spoliation, the dispossessed people shall have the right to the lawful recovery of its property as well as to an adequate compensation. We are expecting a consideration of admissibility, and we are expecting that in the next commission session in May, the case will be accepted for admissibility by the commission. The Equatorial Guinean government has not responded to two of our filings. We hope that, particularly as regional courts get underway in Africa, such as the SADC Court, the ECOWAS Court of Justice, and the new African Court of Justice and Human Rights, that the web of accountability for those who perpetrate and those who facilitate grand corruption will span all the inhabited continents of the world. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Lisa Misol, and I work as a researcher at Human Rights Watch, specializing in business and human rights. And I'm going to present some of the findings of a forthcoming report that was prepared by a colleague of mine. If I could, could I ask for some technical assistance? The mouse is not appearing. I apologize. So let me just begin. My colleague Alex Vines has carried out our research on Equatorial Guinea, and what I wanted to focus on for the purposes of today's panel is economic and social rights, where we have excuse me. So I'll just go ahead and begin. Civil and political rights, as you've heard, we've had glaring problems in that area in Equatorial Guinea, but we think it's also important to think about economic and social rights. So to start, the international standards on economic and social rights, I've got some excerpts here. There's an international covenant covering that, and the international standards recognize that governments have limited resources. They don't propose government should do, can immediately bring into effect economic and social rights, but they do call on governments and states have an obligation to improve the realization of these rights over time, progressively achieve, and they should do so commensurate with available resources. And therefore, judging violations of economic and social rights really calls on you to dig a little deeper what's going on behind the scenes and to evaluate government policy and finances as well as conditions on the ground. And our conclusion, and I'll explain our analysis, is that the problems of governmental corruption and also financial mismanagement in Equatorial Guinea have in fact contributed to poverty and deprivation, and that the circumstances rise to the level of amounting to human rights violations. And so what I'm going to do is explain the elements of our analysis and the facts underlying them. So, to begin, Equatorial Guinea has plentiful resources. This is not a situation of a government faced with constrained spending, and that is because of oil revenues, which have grown 100 times from 1992 to the present. And you'll see here an illustration of that. GDP per capita, given the population of the country, it's on par with that of Italy, if you make the calculations. And yet, all that revenue has not translated into widespread economic benefits. Instead, what we see is very poor living conditions. The UN keeps statistics, which are really helpful to do this kind of analysis. And I've got here just some illustrations. I'll mention a couple of them. They look at something called the Human Development Index, and they compare that to GDP per capita. The gap between available resources and human development in Equatorial Guinea is one of the largest in the world. Levels of severe poverty have been compared to those of Haiti, according to the UN statistics. So think about the wealth of Italy, the conditions of Haiti. And you can see there that conditions for much of the population are very difficult. And so we have to ask ourselves why, what's going on? Lots of money, very poor economic and social conditions. And there's a three-part answer. We have to look at corruption, mismanagement, and misguided spending. And I'm going to address each in turn. Ken had mentioned the Riggs Bank investigation. A lot of things had spun off from that. And we do have a grave concern about the lavish spending on the part of government officials that we have concluded comes at the expense of providing social services like primary education and basic health. And so there are some dramatic examples that have reached the press and indeed the courts. I should mention that yet another case alleges another $6 million in car purchases by the president's son. So just compare that to the social spending that we'll be discussing in a moment. Second piece of the puzzle is financial mismanagement. So there's money that's lost to corruption that just never is on the books, and there's money that should be on the books but disappears. And we assess that there are four different elements to how that resources are being forsaken. I'll just touch on a couple of them. Equatorial Guinea's contracts with oil companies generally provide that the government gets about 15 to 40% of the revenues, but the typical average for other countries in sub-Saharan Africa is more like 45 to 90%. You have borrowing against future oil revenues at very high interest rates, which is quite costly, keeping accounts abroad, and other issues. No independent audits in the country. And while we have seen the government's pledges to EITI and it's now being considered as a candidate country, we're not yet seeing any meaningful progress to actually uphold the standards of EITI. And indeed, there is no real civil society in the country that's able to be active on these issues and able to take part in EITI, which is indeed a requirement. And I should mention EITI covers the money coming in, the revenues, and there's even less transparency on the expenditure side. So a complex set of difficulties. We also have the money that is allocated to social services, and we consider that to be very inadequate. If you compare this first diagram, pre-oil days, percentage of government spending going to social services was dramatically higher than it is after the country is able to benefit from oil wealth. The second chart shows allocated funds for social services compared to actual expenditures. The government has made a greater commitment over time to social spending, and yet it's only spending a portion of what it has pledged to spend in these areas. So putting all of this together, we do come to the conclusion that funds have been needlessly diverted away from social spending and from building up institutions that are needed to achieve fulfillment of social and economic rights. And so you have suffering and deprivation that really could have been prevented, for which there's not an adequate explanation. And that's how we conclude that this does amount to a violation under international standards. And yet, given Equatorial Guinea's strategic importance, it is able to carry on with its international partnerships despite a record on civil and political and economic and social rights that's very troubling. And we feel that various actors have really missed opportunities to press transparency and accountability and to work positively to provide the institutions that are needed to bring about changes. And so we would hope to see more serious engagement on these issues by all parties. I apparently am doing okay on time. So I'll take a few moments to talk about lessons for advocacy, just some general principles that perhaps could be of interest for further discussion. One is the importance of capacity building. Economic and social rights, it's to document them. In many situations, you can gather information on the ground. In Equatorial Guinea, it can be quite hard because there's actually, the government is very hostile to efforts to collect information and distribute it. And yet, there are some things that can be done, including drawing on international data. So working with information from the ground and putting those stories together with this comparative data that the UN and international financial institutions develop. And then weaving that data into our analyses, into our thinking, into our arguments as a tool that can be quite useful, especially when there is evidence of violations of economic and social rights, making those part of the conversation as well as civil and political rights. Where warranted, where it's determined that there are violations, then it's worth having an engagement with the government on that. The government has pledged to be more transparent and to improve social spending, and so we need to keep that conversation going and see what more can be done to actually bring that about as a reality. And also need to develop and use tools to hold the government accountable to its obligations. And international actors have a great role to play, and we hope they'll do so. I did include a few slides with selected recommendations to different parties. And I think perhaps because they're a little dense, we won't have time for them, but let me just leave up a slide about recommendations for the government itself. Because we will have the opportunity now to hear from the ambassador, I'm very much looking forward to seeing what the government's plans are to tackle these issues, and so that we can all see greater fulfillment of the full spectrum of human rights in the future. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Maria Koulouris, and I am the Program Director for the Natural Resources and Human Rights Initiative at Global Rights. Global Rights is a non-governmental organization based in Washington, D.C., and our mission is human rights. We are a human rights organization, but we are a capacity-building human rights organization. We believe that change comes from the ground up, and that to secure human rights, we must build and strengthen local actors on the ground, civil society organizations, including human rights organizations, because only with a vibrant and powerful civil society can we secure human rights in a sustainable way. I direct the newest initiative at Global Rights on natural resources and human rights, which seeks to strengthen the capacity of civil society organizations in Guinea, Congo, Brazzaville, and DRC on economic and social rights violations that are associated with the exploitation of natural resources. I'm here to talk about Equatorial Guinea because in designing that initiative, I visited Equatorial Guinea as well as Liberia and the 3 other countries I mentioned. But before I talk about my visit, I'd like to say just another word about global rights, and that is that we build capacity of civil society organizations by training, mentoring, and working alongside groups on the ground. We do this so that we can help them better document and monitor human rights violations, advocate and contribute to policy development and legislation in their respective countries. We help them litigate, bring cases before courts as well as regional courts. We help them conduct international advocacy before institutions such as the United Nations, and we help them do better community mobilizing around human rights issues. The Natural Resources and Human Rights Initiative, as I mentioned earlier, was based on an assessment that I carried out in 5 countries. And the objectives were, I'd say, 4. First, to understand what the human rights issues that are associated with the exploitation of natural resources. 2, to look at how civil society is addressing these issues. 3, to look at what they're not doing and why. And 4, to look at how Global Rights as a capacity building organization could strengthen their work. What I found in each of the countries was a very similar picture. The same patterns of human rights violations occurring, many of the ones that my colleagues talked about. But the most common complaint from the civil society person to the cab driver to a farmer was always the same, that our lives are not improving, but we know that our country is rich. So why do I still have to walk for 10 kilometers to go get water? Or why don't I have health care in my community? Why do I need to travel 50 kilometers to go to a health clinic? Why is the clinic in my community only open from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. and all emergencies are evacuated in a 4-hour drive? Alongside that very common complaint, this issue of our lives not improving was also, not only are our lives not improving, they're actually getting more difficult. There are negative impacts of natural resource exploitation on our lives, and some of these apply to Equatorial Guinea and others don't. A very common complaint, for instance, was that these big companies are coming into our country, our land is being turned over, and we have no say. We don't participate. We're not consulted in the process. In some cases, there are expropriations of people's homes or people's lands to give way to companies coming in. In mining and logging countries, which it hasn't really been talked about, at least not here, Equatorial Guinea is also a country that's very rich in timber. And although I did not look at that industry, in other countries there are a lot of security concerns around illegal logging and abuse of power, killings, torture, arbitrary arrests, arbitrary detention. There are also pollution, companies not following industry standards, resulting in toxic dumping, contamination of soil, water, for communities that actually depend, unlike you and I here, they depend on the rivers and on their soil to grow their food and drink water. This situation is aggravated, as my colleagues mentioned, by a lack of rule of law, a very weak judicial system, and lack of accountability, because, as was mentioned by Ken earlier, we're talking about countries where vast resources exist and the government doesn't need the support, or they don't have an incentive to account to their population. Equatorial Guinea, to be more specific, is no exception to this picture. We know that it's a very small country with a very small population and a very big GDP, as was mentioned by Lisa. And there's very little impact being seen on the ground in the enjoyment of basic rights like the right to water or the right to health or education. There appear to be some projects underway in this area. We heard about a social development fund in other panels, but it's very unclear even now whether or not funds under that social development fund have actually been released. There are talks of $40 million, but the projects are not yet tangible. And this is after 15 years of oil exploitation in Equatorial Guinea. There are mega hospitals that are being built. There are pictures that I've seen of a hospital in Bata, but from accounts that I've heard, it's these hospitals with a lot of very strong equipment, very big modern technology, are not accessible to the poor. I know people that went to the basic public hospital in Malabo and were asked to pay a bribe to enter, and that is the basic hospital in Malabo, let alone the major one in Bata. So I can only imagine what that situation would be. Schools are ill-equipped, teachers are inadequately remunerated, parents often have to supplement salaries for teachers, even though primary education should be free. And I know of negative impacts of the injection of wealth in Equatorial Guinea, which have been evidenced by expropriations and displacements of the poor without adequate notice or compensation. So there are ample examples in Malabo of individuals that have been expropriated of their homes in shanty towns that have been basically torn down in places like Nubili and Buena Esperanza is where they're building social housing. But shanty towns have been torn down to make way for stadiums or highways or even social housing. But when you go talk to the people that have been expropriated for social housing, they're told they will have access to a new home. You find out that they actually have to pay installments to own this new home that is under the social housing project. And I have heard from many individuals that the price to be paid over several years is $30,000, which may not seem like a lot to us, but for someone who lives on $1 or $2 a day, that's a fortune. I also visited social housing projects and saw 4x4s and satellite dishes on top of the homes. And so there's evidence that these homes are being built and that actually wealthy or middle-class individuals are the ones that are having access to them. There are stories, testimonies being given of individuals that were expropriated and that sold their rights to wealthier individuals. They sold their rights to the social housing to wealthier individuals because they could not afford it. This situation, and I won't go into the weak judicial system or undertrained police, et cetera, because those issues were already brought up, but one of the most distressing things I found in Equatorial Guinea was what I couldn't find out, and that is because there's a stark difference in Equatorial Guinea when we look at other countries where there is vibrant civil society. I couldn't get information because people were too afraid to talk. They were afraid of what it would mean. There's a history of repression against dissent in Equatorial Guinea, and anyone that criticizes the government is assimilated to the political opposition, which is a force to be silenced. There's no civil society organization in Equatorial Guinea that criticizes the government or that participates in decision-making processes. Other countries I visited have civil society that are acting as watchdogs, as monitors of government actions and policies. They work to defend and protect individuals that come face to face with abuse of power and denial of basic rights. They provide a voice for marginalized communities in public debate, and they act as stakeholders in some countries. Government actually engage in conversations with civil society organizations, and they're able to contribute to public policy. That has been traditionally denied in Equatorial Guinea, and it's not to say that the situation is wonderful in other countries in the continent or even in the ones that I visited. There's a lot of work to be done, but there is much more political space in other countries than there is in Equatorial Guinea. I do want to say that in the last 2 years or so, there has been some opening of political space in Equatorial Guinea, and in this notion that civil society can exist and has something to say, at least in terms of increased transparency as Equatorial Guinea has become a candidate country for EITI. It's provided an opportunity for at least civil society to begin to have a voice, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think that if we're serious about human rights, if we all agree that everyone here and everyone in Equatorial Guinea should have drinking water, that they should be free of torture, that they should enjoy their homes, then I think that we need to not only promote transparency, combat corruption, increase rule of law, but also invest in strengthening civil society. Thank you.
Yo voy a ser muy breve, excesivamente breve. Y lo voy a hacer en la medida en que la filosofía que nos ha traído aquí al gobierno es para escucharles a ustedes, en las quejas y en las denuncias. Voy a ser tanto más breve cuanto que en estas quejas y denuncias nosotros queremos creer que es con toda la buena intención de ver mejorar el camino de Guinea Ecuatorial hacia el progreso. Y en diciendo eso, porque yo me veo un poco en el banco de los acusados, porque uno de los que han intervenido dice que esperamos que el embajador nos diga, nos responda, nos deje de responder. El embajador no va a decir ni responder a nada, en la medida en que son ustedes organizaciones que trabajan con el gobierno de Guinea Ecuatorial. Y me alegra mucho porque ustedes han reconocido avances. Señores, Guinea Ecuatorial hasta hace 14 años estaba olvidado por todo el mundo. Y pasábamos dificultades y no había nadie al lado. Y pasábamos penalidades y no había nadie al lado. Señores, Guinea Ecuatorial está empezando a avanzar. Usted ha hablado de agua potable, cuando en los años 80 no se nos dejó agua potable. Pero ahora les puedo garantizar que quizás a finales de este año la habrá para todos, en la medida en que el gobierno está trabajando en eso. Yo creo que 14 años de producción de petróleo, parece que todo se focaliza en el petróleo. 14 años en la producción de petróleo para un país que hace apenas 14 años era el más pobre de África. No tenía nada. Y los que sabemos la historia de Guinea Ecuatorial, cuando sube el presidente de Obiang al poder, el Estado había desaparecido totalmente. La sociedad ecuatoriana había desaparecido a todos los niveles. Y creemos que 14 años, señores, dennos tiempo, ayúdennos. Me alegra que ustedes hayan hablado de avance en materia de derechos humanos. Y el gobierno está haciendo esfuerzos. Yo creo que esta mañana, cuando la embajadora de Guinea Ecuatorial en los Estados Unidos, con residencia en Washington, cuando habló, pasó una especie de revista de todos los esfuerzos que está haciendo el gobierno en materia de derechos humanos, que no es exclusivo Guinea Ecuatorial. Tendríamos una lista larga, incluso en los países más avanzados, hablar en derechos humanos y de violaciones. Amnistía Internacional, la señora ha hablado efectivamente de problemas de violación de derechos. Yo creo que es un aprendizaje que aún no ha superado ni los países más avanzados. Podríamos hablar de este mismo país, que en los informes de Amnistía Internacional figuran también. Entonces yo sinceramente he dicho que no voy a hablar porque primero no sabía que se me iba a poner en el banco de acusados el nombre del gobierno. Venía a una conferencia de tipo cultural, aunque entiendo que también esto es cultura, la cultura del pueblo de Guinea Ecuatorial. Simplemente decirles a ustedes que nos congratulamos por el hecho de que ustedes siguen de cerca la evolución de la sociedad ecuatoguineana. Y nosotros entendemos que es por el bien del pueblo de Guinea Ecuatorial, preocupación que comparte el gobierno de Guinea Ecuatorial enteramente. Preocupación que comparte el presidente de la República de Guinea Ecuatorial y las instituciones de Guinea Ecuatorial. De hecho, a todos los niveles los esfuerzos del gobierno son notorios, tanto en la mejora de las instituciones, tanto en la mejora, como lo ha dicho esta mañana la embajadora, incluso con formación de personal de seguridad. Ustedes saben que en todas partes el uniforme envenena los comportamientos de las personas. Y entonces pues tiene siempre a la violencia. Y eso ocurre en Guinea Ecuatorial, como ocurre en este país, como ocurre en España, como ocurre en todos los países. Es formación. Y mi gobierno está firmemente comprometido a eso. Quiero terminar diciendo que no voy a, porque si me pusiera a contestar uno por uno de las alegaciones que han hecho aquí, primero no tengo elementos a mano, porque podría debatir algunos, pero no creo que sea el contexto ni el momento. Como he dicho, empezar diciendo que agradecemos su interés por nuestro país. Estas denuncias nosotros no las tomamos a mal, ni nos ofendemos, todo lo contrario, consideramos el dicho de quien bien te quiere te hará llorar. Si ustedes se duelen de algunos problemas en Guinea Ecuatorial y creen que en diciéndolos, en denunciándolos, nosotros los vamos a tener en cuenta, claro que los vamos a tener en cuenta y los tenemos en cuenta, porque lo han reconocido ustedes mismos. Los tenemos en cuenta, pero es cuestión de tiempo. Es cuestión de tiempo porque no tiene tiempo. Es un aprendizaje continuo y permanente. Si ustedes en las grandes sociedades no han superado el problema de derechos humanos, no lo han superado, porque aún serán casos. Cuanto más un país de una independencia, dicen 40 años en la historia es un segundo. Entonces, yo quiero terminar agradeciéndoles a ustedes por recordarnos esta obligación que nosotros ya hemos asumido como gobierno, con alguna que otra falla, con algún que otro retraso, pero con la firme voluntad de seguir adelante, porque el país hay que construirlo. Nosotros lo cogimos en una situación en que nadie apostaba un céntimo por él. Hoy en día es la atracción de todo el mundo, hoy día es el país donde todo el mundo quiere ver cómo utiliza qué, y nosotros lo agradecemos y lo entendemos. Pero hay un gobierno ahí, hay una sociedad que avanza, y señores, con mis agradecimientos, con realmente mi reconocimiento de la labor de ustedes en Guinea Ecuatorial, quiero decir que sigan, porque el gobierno de Guinea Ecuatorial agradece lo que ustedes hacen, agradecen sus preocupaciones y está firmemente comprometido a seguir trabajando en el sentido del bien del pueblo de Guinea Ecuatorial. Muchas gracias.
Buenas tardes, paisanos y paisanas. My friends, 16 years ago, 1993, my cousin Eusebio Puello Gerona fled into the mountains of Annobon, the island that I'm from, right? And he was fleeing for his life because there was a group of military soldiers. They have landed on the island and proceeded to arresting all the young men they could find, right? They tortured several of these young men. I mean, even today when I travel to Madrid, I still run into some of these young men that are seeking medical help for some of the physical pain that they suffer from that torture, right? That afternoon, this was in 1993, August of 1993. That afternoon when my father came home and I asked him what he was going to do about what had just happened to our cousin and what was he going to do about the fact that his home in Annobon, San Antonio de Palais, had just been burned down because they couldn't find my cousin. His response to me was that there was nothing you could do. You know, you just had to rebuild. And I know where he was coming from. You know, I know where that sense of powerlessness was coming from. I had grown up there. But I refused to believe that there was nothing citizens of a country could do in the face of injustice. I refuse to believe that there's nothing citizens of a country could do in the face of absolute impunity. So those of you that can understand that story, understand how today seeing these organizations here is a dream, well, half of a dream come true for me, you know. Seeing these human rights organizations here, they have begun to pay attention to the issues of Equatorial Guinea and have begun to help us find ways to overcome some of the problems that have been raised by my colleagues here is a dream come true for me. I should take the time to mention a few organizations that due to different reasons could not make it here. So in Spain, for instance, there are a couple of organizations that have been working very closely with. One is the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And the other one is the APDH, which was already mentioned by my colleague Ken. In the UK, there is the Global Witness and the International Bar Association. In the US, organizations that couldn't make it here, some of them had already been registered but had to take off their name. Freedom House, who has continuously and periodically published reports on Equatorial Guinea. The Revenue Watch Institute, who has been working very closely with some of the people here in this room on issues of transparency in the extractive industry in Equatorial Guinea. The International Budget Partnership, you know, which just in February of this year released the results of Open Budget Index, transparency in budgetary issues in Equatorial Guinea. Now, how do I come into human rights? The story that I told you at the beginning profoundly shaped how I went about doing things from then on. A year after that, 1994, I came to the United States, initially thinking that I wanted to be a journalist to write about these situations, and eventually ran into the law. And actually what was happening in 1994 is that oil explorations were going on. Oil was being discovered in Equatorial Guinea. The US ambassador, then John Bennett, was leaving Equatorial Guinea. But within a few years of him leaving and oil being discovered, the economy of Equatorial Guinea more than doubled. And I began to realize how the future of Equatorial Guinea, the future in terms of human rights, rule of law, transparency, were going to be inextricably linked to the US. Was going to be linked to the US interest in oil and gas that came from that region, and was going to be linked to the US foreign policy in that region. And that's why I founded EG Justice. You see, when these organizations talk about the staggering numbers that Lisa put up, GDP, infant mortality rates, life expectancy, et cetera, those are numbers that to me represent faces and names. When I think about maternal mortality, I'm thinking about my sister who made it alive to the hospital, Chiquitina, and there was no doctor to treat her, and she died of a minor complication. When I'm thinking about infant mortality, I'm thinking about my nephews who died at the age of 3 years old because of malnutrition in Equatorial Guinea. So I'm thinking about real faces, and I suspect many of you, paisanos y paisanas, are in the same boat. We are thinking about real people here. And that's why I founded Equatorial Guinea, because, again, I believe that there's something we can do. I founded Equatorial Guinea. I founded EG Justice. Ya quisiera yo, right? And EG Justice, what we want to do, is simple. Work on some of these issues that have been raised here. You see, I jokingly tell my friends that this whole issue of all these white organizations or white human rights activists working in Equatorial Guinea in issues still have a very sense of colonialism to me. We suffering the problems, these white people addressing the problems. So how do we Equatorial Guineans begin to get on the platforms of helping these organizations do this essential work, right? There are many things that you can do with a human rights organization or with a small organization. My organization is small with limited resources, so we do 4 things. We do some litigation, working in collaboration with some other organizations. We do some international advocacy with politicians and decision makers around the world. We do some human rights documentation and reporting. And we do some education work, basic mobilizing the Equatorial Guinean society on issues that, again, have to do with human rights, transparency, rule of law. And I think of rule of law in terms of public participation, citizens' participation in the decisions that affect their lives. One last thing I'm going to say is there is an activist, an Australian activist, that once said, if you're coming to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you're coming because our futures are bound together, then let's work together. And in many ways, I think that is what these organizations are doing, coming to work together with us. But we have to be there to do this work together with them. There are certain things that these organizations cannot know because they're not from Equatorial Guinea. To give you a silly example, recently an economist was doing some work on Equatorial Guinea and showed me the report. And one of the findings that this report included was something that said that Annobon, the province of Annobon, was the richest province in Equatorial Guinea. And that is because he didn't take into account how many people live in Annobon. And again, this is an economist that has not lived in Annobon and does not know Annobon the way I know Ambo. I want to again take the time to thank my esteemed colleagues here. And I want to welcome now to the podium someone that for many years has been an inspiration to me, an inspiration to my work, and that is Peter Rosenblum, And again, in shaping this panel and in thinking about what I wanted this panel to address, I wanted this to be the beginning of a conversation between those of us, Equatorial Guineans, that want to work on these issues that the ambassador had admitted that even the government realizes that we have to work on. So those of us that want to work on these issues, there are organizations that are far more advanced than we are in addressing some of these issues, and we have to work together, I'm going to shut up because I only have a short time here. But really, thank you very much, and I'm going to be here for the rest of the conference. And I really welcome the opportunity to having a conversation with Equatorial Guineans that want to engage in the work of promoting human rights, promoting citizens' participation, promoting transparency in Equatorial Guinea. Thank you.
So thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for allowing me to join you in this. I think when I'm Peter Rosenblum, and I teach at Columbia Law School, and most of my career has been spent working on human rights issues in other parts of Africa, and so I have something of a comparative perspective. I recently had the pleasure and the opportunity to visit Equatorial Guinea and get the beginnings of some sense of a comparison. But I want to say, if you're, and I think it's come across in this panel, if you're trying to understand the complexity of telling the story of human rights in Equatorial Guinea, you have to consider the extreme specificity of the story and the way in which Equatorial Guinea fits in Africa, in history, in terms of the economy. At times it seems to me that many analysts and activists are caught, and as maybe Equatorial Guineans themselves are, somewhere between the earlier history of extreme repression and the focus on the horrors of civil and political rights violations, and a moment in time when the country finds itself increasingly integrated into the global economy, where on a day-to-day basis, some of those extreme civil and political rights violations seem no longer to be high on the agenda, and other issues seem to have now come to the fore. And you've heard it here. On the one hand, the long history of Amnesty International's involvement in those kinds of civil and political rights violations, in the horrors of torture and of disappearance, of arbitrary execution. And those issues, those problems haven't stopped, but somehow things have changed in the country. Now, have they changed because there are no longer the same kinds of political challenges that there were before, so it's no longer necessary to engage in that same level of repressive behavior? Have they changed because there are economic opportunities that enable people to make do in a way that they haven't been able to before? Or has there been an actual change in terms of the government and its willingness to tolerate some levels of opposition? Those are themselves questions. I think that as activists, we're not necessarily served by focusing too much on the horror story of Equatorial Guinea, because the reality seems to be changing, and that's something that we have to be able to take into account and to be able to understand. Those of my friends who have been traveling to EG continuously over the last 10 years will say to me, my God, in the last 2 years, it's dramatically different. To return to Malabo, to find that you can get around, to find that there aren't as many roadblocks and police checks or military checks, that you seem to be able to travel more freely, that the openness of the repression that was there before is no longer as visible. But at the same time, as we've heard here, there's still a great deal of fear, and there's a great deal of limitation in terms of the kinds of stories that are emerging and the kinds of people that are organizing. My sense in comparing Equatorial Guinea to the other countries I've been traveling to is that it certainly is a critical moment, and the capacity for dramatic change is there, but the fear is only lifting slowly, and it certainly has not changed sides yet. Increasingly, there are the individuals in the country who are willing to speak out, knowing that someone is standing next to them, as we saw, listening to what they're saying, and yet they speak. At the same time, it hasn't reached those proportions that I've seen at other times in Africa, in Kinshasa in 1989, in Chad in the 1990s, in places where repression continued, but fear changed sides. And almost as one, society seemed to look out and say, we're no longer worried. We're no longer concerned about the possibilities of repression. We are going to take action. We are going to engage. We are going to communicate with the international actors. We are going to share the stories we have, and we are going to continue pushing for some kind of change. We've seen here from the stories that you've heard already today that there's a range of advocacy, and the advocacy is the Amnesty International style of naming and shaming, of urgent actions. That continues, that's necessary. But a whole new kind of advocacy is emerging that takes advantage of new connections, of new contacts that have made, of the new economy that's evolving in the country. And so the stories that we've heard about the work of the Open Society Justice Initiative, which is also being picked up by organizations that Tutu referred to, organizations like Global Witness, the kind of work that now Human Rights Watch is focusing on, where they're looking more at some of the economic links and the economic connections and trying to understand how those are being mobilized by forces within the country to keep control, and how we might also use advocacy to contest them. I would point out, and I think you've heard it here, but I think we're aware of it, that there's new access to the country that wasn't available before, but it's not clear that everybody's taking advantage of it. Because of the integration of the country into the global economy, it's easier to travel there. More people are traveling there with other kinds of experiences and connections. Many more Cameroonians engage who have been involved in the markets and are aware of what's happening in the country in a way that that we might be able to gain access to that we didn't before, other foreigners who are involved in the markets at all levels, from top to bottom. Americans can go there without a visa. Why aren't more of us going there to collect information, to share that information, to reach out and to talk to people, and to make the links that otherwise haven't been made? The opportunities for taking advantage of some of the international economic links. Tutu mentioned the importance of the United States, recognizing, on the one hand, we hear all the time, well, as an oil state, it no longer depends on the United States or on the World Bank or others as a funder. But it does obviously depend on those same countries and those same funders for very important reputational values. And we've seen that in the openness to the United States that continues, in the investment of money in a lobbying firm like Cassidy and Associates, in order to promote the reputation, in order to respond, to make sure that the ambassador is here, that others are here, in order to respond to the complaints. So we know that Equatorial Guinea, that the government also considers its reputational interest to be of great importance, and there are places where that can be challenged. Many of them might be in the United States. The United States got behind the Social Development Fund in Equatorial Guinea. The United States USAID received $5 million and $15 million from the government of Equatorial Guinea in order to help them develop a social development fund. Well, let's call on the United States senators and congressmen to be accountable for what happens with that. Where has that money gone? Why hasn't it been spent yet for the development projects that were initially intended? Let's look for those links. What are the measures of progress that we might look for in the coming years? Well, you've heard from the panelists here so far that there's still a very thin civil society in Equatorial Guinea. There are individuals who are courageous, who take stands, who send out information, but it's been very difficult to form organizations. The law in Equatorial Guinea limits the kind of organizations that can be formed. It requires approvals. Those approvals have not yet truly been forthcoming for organizations that want to do work on environmental causes, on human rights, in the press, and in other spheres. Progress would mean, I think, in part, seeing civil society organizations form, organize, be registered, and be able to take stands. We can look very clearly at one of the projects that's in place. The European Union is supposed to be working with the government of Equatorial Guinea to help the development of civil society. Let's monitor that. Let's find out how they're doing. Let's look and see what progress there might be. In EITI, we've heard about the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. It opens up a whole section for civil society. I had the chance to visit with the civil society members of the EITI in Equatorial Guinea. Well, there's the Music Union, there's women, there's some who work on AIDS orphans. They're well-intentioned people, but they are not organizations with capacity, and they are not those organizations or even those people in the society in Equatorial Guinea who have been paying attention to these issues in the past. Let's watch and see. Will the international community insist that the civil society in EITI be the civil society that's capable and has the capacity and the interest in following those issues and is enabled to do so? And there are other measures that I think that we can look for in small ways. The press. There is no independent press. There are some independent journalists at times who have taken, again, courageous stands. Reports that come to RFI or to the Agence France Presse. Let's look to see whether the efforts to open up newspapers are accepted, are encouraged. And of course, in the area of political opposition, what can we say except also to recognize that in fact the political diversity has diminished in the country over the last 10 years, even as we've seen some openings in other areas. And there will not be any real progress, I think, until we see more diversity in civil society, more diversity or a real presence within the press, and some political opposition beyond the single opponent in Parliament today who's able to monitor and to pressure for change within. And until that time, I think the work of international organizations is going to be dominant in being able to open up the spaces and keep the pressure on the country. Thank you. me his story. He gave me the dates and the times that he prepared that he was proposing to start a newspaper, and the fact that he didn't get the approvals from the government. No, I'll send you, and we'll see. No, we'll see.
Okay.
And let's see.
Professor Doubleday will ask this question.
Yeah. Well, this is good. I'll send it because it's very specific. I think it's very good. Well, you should know him. I'm forgetting his name. It's
I might have it.
I'm sure I've got it as well. The one who's currently the RFI, the correspondent for Radio France Internationale and Agence France Presse in Equatorial Guinea. He's Equatorial Guinea in Malabo. I'll send you the details. I have the dates, the specific dates, and the name of the newspaper that he proposed, and the way and the rejection.
Yes, the first question is as follows. If the country is as wealthy as Italy, where is all of this money concentrated, considering the people are so poor? Is it concentrated among the elite or certain companies?
What is it?
Yes, would you like me to translate it as well? Ujú. Si el país es tan rico...
Yo le he escuchado perfectamente.
Ajá,
Yeah,
vale.
exactly.
Vale. Si el país es tan rico como Italia, ¿dónde está este dinero? Dado que la gente es tan pobre, ¿está concentrado entre la élite o ciertas empresas?
Yo puedo contestar.
Esta es la pregunta.
El problema también es que ustedes se basan simplemente en estadísticas y sacan sus porcentajes. Y entonces me da a mí la impresión de que usted me está presentando una distribución simple como si estuviéramos en una tasca y después pues hay dinero, mira, tú tomas este sobre, tú tomas este sobre, tú tienes este sobre. Yo le he dicho el antecedente de que partimos de un país que era extremadamente pobre, falto de todo tipo de infraestructuras. El señor al lado, que no me acuerdo de su nombre, Rosenberg, ha dicho algo muy positivo aquí, que los que han viajado a Guinea Ecuatorial últimamente han visto a dónde va este dinero. Han visto a dónde va este dinero y eso de que han visitado seguramente parte del país. Y yo les estoy diciendo y les estoy emplazando que son 14 años que se ha empezado a tener beneficios del petróleo. Y entonces yo les estoy diciendo que yo creo que es un análisis simplista. El país es rico, ¿a dónde va el dinero? Yo no creo que deberíamos ir a este tipo de análisis porque deberíamos ir a ver qué es lo que se está haciendo con el dinero. Y entonces las transformaciones reales que se han producido en el país a partir del momento en que el dinero del petróleo está empezando a llegar. Ahora, yo no quiero meterme en lo de decir que la población es pobre, porque la población no es pobre, porque yo llego aquí y entonces si tú vas a Brooklyn, entonces encontrarás gente pues durmiendo en las calles. Y yo no voy a acusar al gobierno de Estados Unidos de eso. ¿Entiende? Es que la sociedad es así, todas las sociedades son así. Entonces, en la medida que se va resolviendo paulatinamente los problemas en una sociedad, yo creo que esto es lo que interesa. Y es lo que está haciendo el gobierno de Guinea Ecuatorial. Es la única respuesta que le puedo dar.
Yes, I've been asked to briefly translate and to give an extremely short summary. Part of the essential answer was that the ambassador considers this to be a simplistic question and that a trip to Brooklyn would reveal similar inequalities of wealth and poverty. Second question. In recent years, allegations of human rights abuses have been used to legitimate military intervention in the United States, in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the former Yugoslavia. Is this a concern for the ambassador or for the researchers on this panel?
Si entiendo bien.
Traducción. Perdón. En los años recientes, alegaciones de abusos contra los derechos humanos se han hecho para legitimar intervenciones militares de los Estados Unidos en Irak, Afganistán y el ex-Yugoslavia. ¿Esto preocupa o no al embajador o los otros panelistas?
Al embajador no le preocupa, por cuanto que si el embajador no pudiera hablar como un ciudadano cualquiera, yo le daría otra respuesta en cuanto a la intervención en Irak y en otras partes, pero no se la puedo dar porque soy embajador y me debo a cierta conducta. Muchas gracias. Que no tiene nada que ver con abuso de derechos humanos ni nada de eso, pero yo no puedo hablar en estos términos porque soy embajador.
I just wanted to maybe just say that I think the situations that were cited as examples are very different situations, and even under international law, what would be required for military intervention is very different, I think, than what the situation is in Equatorial Guinea. However, I think also what's encouraging is to hear from the ambassador that there is an opening and that we're all here talking about human rights in a way that I'm not sure happens very often. So I'm encouraged to know that the government takes the situation seriously, and I think to talk about military intervention is not exactly relevant right now.
I just wanted to add, I think that the human rights community generally, I mean, we need to be concerned about the elements of cultural imperialism that go into our work and our analysis. Groups like Global Witness, where Maria works, have turned their attention to working with local organizations, in part because of that. Their purpose is to work to help support the local organizations and the local people. What makes Equatorial Guinea different at this point is you can't create a human rights organization locally. It will not get approval from the Ministry of Interior to form, and so it's only left to individuals who might be courageous enough to take the risk. So I think as long as there isn't the space in the country enabling individuals and groups to form, often the voice has to come from the outside. It's the individuals inside, but it's organizations on the outside that have to then echo that back. But let's get to the point where it's the organizations in the country that are analyzing the country in a nuanced and a diverse way so that we don't have to rely on the external analyses.
Thank you. The next question reads as follows in English. We hear this morning that Black Beach has been shut down. What do we know of other detention centers that have incarcerated dissidents? Sí, dice la pregunta que hemos oído esta mañana que se ha cerrado Black Beach, que sabemos de otras prisiones.
Black Beach no se ha cerrado en principio. Black Beach se ha reformado y se ha remodelado y es una prisión como cualquier otra prisión en el mundo. Y le voy a decir que es una de las mejores de África ahora, en las condiciones.
The next question. Besides advocacy organizations, I'm sorry? I'm sorry. Si entendí bien, ha dicho que Black Beach ahora es entre los mejores prisiones de...
Yo le invito a visitarla si quiere. Le puedo extender una invitación.
No, pero quería entender, asegurarme. According to the ambassador,
Yo estuve en Black Beach en los momentos en que era Black Beach, en los tiempos de Macías, y entonces yo le estoy diciendo que hoy en día es una prisión porque no es un hotel, pero hoy en día entra usted en Black Beach, bueno, es una prisión y comparativamente con otras muchas en África está muy lejos.
Thank you. Before translating, I wanted to be sure I'd heard the answer correctly, and the answer is that Black Beach is not indeed a hotel, but that in comparative terms it is relatively good. It is amongst the best in Africa.
And it was not closed, but rather remodeled.
Remodeled, yeah.
Can I say something, please, concerning this issue of Black Beach? I think the issue is not whether Black Beach is closed, remodeled. I think for me the issue is an issue of arbitrary detentions. It doesn't matter to me whether you're arbitrarily detaining someone and putting them in a hotel. So there are underlying questions that we have to be asking. They're more serious than whether Black Beach is still Black Beach or White Beach. Thank you.
¿Puedo hablar?
¿Puedo hablar yo?
para contestarle.
No, yo quería... voy a hablar... Ok. Voy a hablar en castellano entonces ahora. Y quería reiterar lo que ha dicho Tutu aquí. Sí, la cárcel, todas las informaciones que nosotros tenemos es que la cárcel de Black Beach ha sido remodelada, hay más espacio, hay más luz, etcétera, etcétera. Pero eso no es la cuestión. La cuestión es de lo que sucede allí dentro. El hecho de que hay gente detenida en incomunicado, en celdas, que no salen que no salen, que llevan años, hay alguna gente allí que no ha salido durante años. Eso es lo que es la preocupación, no si la prisión es más bonita, más nueva, si tiene más ventanas, no las tiene.
The answer is that...
Un momento.
Can I just translate the answer, please? The answer given is that the question of whether the prison has been remodeled is not the important question. The question is not whether it has more windows, whether there's more space or more light. The question is what happens within that prison. The people held incommunicado, for instance.
Sí, no, pues la cuestión es que, hablando de detenciones, yo creo que esto detención arbitraria habría que matizar. Entonces tiene sus matices para que se determine que una detención ha sido arbitraria o no. Porque aquí se baraja mucho detención arbitraria, y entonces alguien no me ha demostrado las circunstancias que les han llevado a determinar que esta detención ha sido arbitraria. Yo creo que alguien que comete un delito, ¿entiende? Y entonces pues se le detiene. En todo caso, también estoy un poco, yo no voy a decir escandalizado, sorprendido del enfoque que la señora está dando a las cosas, gente que lleva años sin salir, años encerrados, yo no sé, esto a mí me parece kafkiano, pero en fin, como yo ahora me pusiera a hablar pues de gente pues años en el corredor de la muerte en las cárceles de los Estados Unidos, es eso. Entonces yo creo que señora, las cosas no hay que sacarlas de contexto. Gente que está encerrada, no hay nadie ni incomunicado, años sin poder salir. Esto en la prisión de Black Beach, yo no estoy, pero yo sé que no puede ocurrir. Pero quizás usted le dan los informes, porque claro, todo se basa en informes que le dan. Yo no quiero ponerle en entredicho, porque le he dicho que yo les debo mucho respeto y les agradezco el interés, pero yo creo que discrepo un poco con esta visión un poco dantesca de las cosas. Muchas gracias.
The answer was that it is important to take things in context. It's important to nuance the claims of prisoners held without contact with the outside world, that prisoners in the United States also on death row are held incommunicado. The next question reads as follows. It's quite a long question. Besides advocacy organizations attempting to bring change and awareness to social and political issues that Equatorial Guinea is facing, what concrete actions are being taken to achieve governmental financial responsibility by international agencies like the United Nations or the European Union? Why has the United States not attempted reform immediately, given the visible human rights violations? Así que brevemente en español, ¿qué están haciendo las agencias internacionales como Naciones Unidas, la Unión Europea? ¿Y por qué los Estados Unidos no se han intentado reformas inmediatas dando los abusos de derechos humanos?
Yo quiero...
Well, just to cite one example, and it was referenced earlier, the United States government, through USAID, the Agency for International Development, had agreed with the government of Equatorial Guinea to create a social development fund. And that came about after much discussion. And it was nominally established in 2005. I believe it was agreed in 2004. And yet it wasn't fully operational until the end of 2007. It hasn't come anywhere close to realizing its goals. There were a number of projects, some of which ostensibly now have been approved finally, and yet, as was stated, we don't know if they've been carried out. And so I think we can say there's been some engagement, but there hasn't been follow-through. And we're going to hope that changes, and we hope that all of you can can keep raising those questions and raise them with international agencies to keep on the pressure.
En esta materia, el gobierno de Guinea Ecuatorial colabora estrechamente con el de los Estados Unidos y sus agencias. Yo creo que me acuerdo, USD, ¿no? USAID. Ya, entonces, y el gobierno de Guinea Ecuatorial, la parte económica que le ha correspondido la ha puesto, siempre. Y los proyectos están llegando, como acaba de decirlo la señora. En cuanto a lo otro, la pregunta de usted, yo creo que va un poco fuera de contexto, porque en lo que se haga en Guinea Ecuatorial lo hará el gobierno de Guinea Ecuatorial y la sociedad de Guinea Ecuatorial. Estados Unidos no va a hacer nada, ningún Estado va a hacer nada dentro de otro Estado. Entonces, yo creo que el contexto es la colaboración que puede haber, la colaboración entre el gobierno y las instituciones de Guinea Ecuatorial con los gobiernos y las instituciones exteriores, para que vayamos avanzando en lo que quiere el gobierno de Guinea Ecuatorial avanzar, porque pruebas de que quiere avanzar en todos estos extremos la ha dado y sobradamente.
Yes, to translate first, the government of Equatorial Guinea is collaborating with a variety of foreign institutions, including leading United States institutions and agencies. However, it is not appropriate to ask the question, what can the United States do in Equatorial Guinea, because it is not legitimate for a foreign government to intervene in the affairs of a sovereign country.
Yeah, I mean, just one place where the Equatorial Guinean government has... sorry. One place where the government has not been particularly cooperative is in criminal investigations, in particular with regard to the Riggs Bank investigation conducted by the U.S. Senate a few years ago that I mentioned. There was an attempt by the Senate investigators and by bank regulators to try to track down various transfers involving millions of dollars that were made to accounts that were either in offshore entities or in foreign banks, and that looked highly suspicious to U.S. bank regulators. Efforts were made to get cooperation and authorization from Equatorial Guinean officials to be able to track down and identify the purposes and destinations of funds, for example, that were transferred from the revenue account, the oil revenue account of the government. There was a absolute refusal to cooperate in the slightest, and the investigation ran into a brick wall in that regard. So there is selective cooperation with a social development, with the construction of a social development fund that doesn't seem to go anywhere. They may be cooperating, but in other areas they don't necessarily do so.
El gobierno de Guinea Ecuatorial, a raíz del informe Riggs, del Senado sobre Riggs Bank, editó un folleto justificativo que se remitió al Departamento de Estado, entre otras cosas. Pero nadie parece haberlo visto, nadie parece tenerlo en cuenta, y entonces siguen de manera redundante, de manera insistentemente redundante, pues lo de que Riggs Bank, no Riggs Bank, pero nadie, es que a mí me extraña, porque le tomó al gobierno meses editar eso y pagar la traducción al inglés, y se remitió a las instituciones americanas sobre los destinos de los dineros, pero no parece que nadie lo haya visto. Entonces, no sé, realmente estoy un poco sorprendido. Muchas gracias.
Is the ambassador going to be responding to every single comment that every one of us makes? That doesn't seem quite fair. But can I just mention that I have read that report? I am familiar with that report, and the response that he's mentioning does not respond to any of the questions that were raised by the committee. And what it basically says is the president is entitled to engage in any profit-making activity he likes under Equatorial Guinean law and leave us alone. And that's the extent of that report.
Sure. The last claim made by the ambassador was, I believe, that the report on the Riggs Bank scandal has not in fact been read properly by anybody.
No. That there was a response from the government of Equatorial Guinea and that people don't seem to have read it. And that's why
Thank you.
Ken was responding to that.
Peter, were you going to say something?
No, it's
Peter,
okay.
okay.
It's okay.
So I did want to say, yes, certainly I think there is more that the U.S. government can do, you know, and it takes Americans pushing the U.S. government in order for the U.S. government to do anything. And one thing I should tell you about, you know, is that right now there is a bill that is going to be in front of Congress, maybe by next month, and that's the Extractive Industry Transparency Disclosure Act. But for those of you that know how laws are made in the U.S., it's going to require you, American people with voting power, to pressure your congressmen, pressure your representatives, in order for those type of bills, those type of initiatives that support transparency and changes lives of people in places like Equatorial Guinea become law. In order for the Extractive Industry Transparency Disclosure Act to become law in the United States, Americans should do something about it. And I'll be happy to tell you more about this bill, and I'll be happy to tell you how you can get involved. Thank you.
Actually, I did want to, could I just say one more thing about, no, I was going to say that, I mean, it echoes what Tutu has said about the United States. What I can say, again, from comparative experience, is that at the recent past, the United States has played a role that has been cooperative with the government of Equatorial Guinea and is not putting pressure on the country. And a number of us who had the opportunity to visit with the person who's in place of the ambassador, the chargé d'affaires in the country right now, Anton Smith, have been horrified by his discourse because he behaves as if he's a paid representative of the government of Equatorial Guinea. So it happens that we're going through a time when the United States is using really the least amount of its leverage and its advocacy. And I think many people think that will change under the Obama administration, which was not an administration desired by the government of Equatorial Guinea, but that change has not yet been made.
Sorry, there's one final.
We like the government, Obama government.
No.
We do like it. We like it.
One final written question, and one question from the audience which the speaker would like to address directly. So perhaps the two can be conflated. The final written question is as follows. I'll read it and then translate it and then sit down. Para el embajador, ¿cuántos años necesitan más para dejar de torturar? ¿Cuánta cooperación necesitan para aprender a no torturar? In English, for the ambassador, how many more years are necessary to stop torturing? How much cooperation do you need to learn to stop torture?
Buenas tardes. Solo quería puntualizar una cosita de la que hablaba el señor embajador de Guinea Ecuatorial en Inglaterra. Yo creo que al decir usted aquello de que Estados Unidos sigue teniendo serios problemas respecto al tema de los derechos humanos, yo pienso sinceramente que nuestro país, que tiene un segundo en la historia, que son los 40 años, tenemos un segundo en la historia, sí que es un tiempo relativamente corto. Si en estos 40 años nos hemos convertido en el país más rico actualmente en África Central, o sea, más rico en renta per cápita y todo en esos temas. Si hemos podido superar a Camerún, por ejemplo, ¿no cree usted sinceramente que Guinea Ecuatorial puede darle lecciones de derechos humanos en los próximos segundos a un país como los Estados Unidos? Esa era una pregunta para usted. Y para los miembros de las asociaciones de derechos humanos, yo creo que en este tema de los derechos humanos es tan confuso que recibimos información de todas partes, internet, todo el mundo habla, Guinea Ecuatorial, no sé cuánto. Pero yo he visto en Guinea Ecuatorial, en algunos en los medios de comunicación, algunas asociaciones de derechos humanos que dicen que en Guinea Ecuatorial el tema de los derechos humanos está avanzando. Entonces yo, como guineano y vivo en Guinea, yo ya no sé si o nos están tomando el pelo o se están comprando a los que dicen ese tipo de cosas. O sea, sinceramente, yo no sé si alguno de ustedes puede responder a ese tipo de preguntas, ya me gustaría que fuese. Sí. Gracias.
One comment for each panelist, because we need to wrap it up, please.
No, la respuesta a usted es simplemente que podemos dar lecciones a Camerún y podemos dar lecciones a quien sea, siempre que avancemos, y estamos en ello, avanzando. Es que, mira, yo no sé, las sociedades, yo creo que los Estados Unidos, ahora, en los años 50, usted sabe cuál era la situación, sobre todo cuando eras negro. ¿Entiende? Y ya no es ahora. Está avanzando, ha seguido avanzando. Bueno, venimos de una herencia, yo no quiero hablar de ella porque no quiero ofender a españoles, pero venimos de una herencia colonial que no enseñó a la clase militar a otra cosa, sino a otros. Estábamos comentándolo ahora, no sé con quién, cuando íbamos ahí. Pero yo le quiero decir que el problema es paulatino. Y a ustedes, los ecuatorianos, le estaba diciendo ahí que yo me han salido lágrimas, que mira cuánta intelectualidad ecuatoriana hay aquí. Y yo creo que el paso lo debemos dar nosotros mismos. Y yo diría que no desde fuera. Porque es cuando las cosas se arreglen, ¿quién las arregla? Bueno, nosotros ya nos apechugamos con eso. Nos ha tocado bailar con la más fea, el riesgo de todas las acusaciones. Bien, lo asumimos, pero asumimos también el hecho de que nosotros estamos haciendo esfuerzos para avanzar, pero no avanza nadie solo. En una sociedad, el gobierno no puede avanzar solo si la otra parte de la sociedad no pone lo suyo. Estamos aquí en una sala en los Estados Unidos a miles de kilómetros, no estamos en Guinea. Entonces quizás el pequeño reproche muy cariñoso y muy fraternal y muy de hermano que yo podría hacer, ¿entiendes?, a la intelectualidad ecuatoriana que se encuentra aquí.
¿Entiende inglés o solo español? Más o menos. Ok, voy a contestar en español. Disculpe, no es un español perfecto. I'll translate after. Solo quería decir sobre el tema de organizaciones de derechos humanos en Guinea Ecuatorial que están diciendo que las cosas están avanzando en Guinea Ecuatorial. Creo que en todos los países del mundo, sin excepción, aquí también hay organizaciones que están próximos del gobierno y hay organizaciones que son más independientes y eso existe en todas partes del mundo y más en países donde la sociedad civil es bastante joven o no tiene mucha experiencia o donde el espacio político no es muy grande. No existen muchas organizaciones que pueden hablar libremente de la situación de derechos humanos y lo que encontramos en estos países son organizaciones que reciben dinero, fondos del gobierno y que toman posiciones que son más al lado del gobierno. Eso existe en todas partes. No sé de cuáles organizaciones tú estás hablando, pero es una respuesta que aplica en todos países. So I was just saying with regards to civil society organizations, and he asked a question about civil society organizations in Equatorial Guinea that are releasing information on the internet or otherwise about the human rights situation in Equatorial Guinea and that are saying that the human rights situation is improving. I was just saying that in many countries around the world, including here, if not everywhere, there are organizations that are truly independent organizations or others that are closer to the government that receive very often funds from the government as well. And so I can't know which organizations he's referring to, but I think that it's, I didn't say this in Spanish, but I will. I think it's our obligations, everyone's obligation to look into the information, to look into what organizations, where they're getting their funding, what their message is, and to check information. I think that's an obligation that we all have. No sé si has entendido. I just wanted to add in Spanish. Creo que todos tenemos la obligación de mirar las organizaciones, de chequear la información y de ver si la situación está mejorando.
Okay, Bueno, yo no conozco ninguna organización de derechos humanos en Guinea Ecuatorial, por lo tanto, no sé quién está diseminando esa información. Decías que era la prensa que estaba diciendo... Si,
Pero no solo son organizaciones en Guinea.
Un momento, por favor. Si he entendido bien tu pregunta, era que la prensa en Guinea Ecuatorial dice que hay organizaciones que dicen. Entonces, no entendí bien la pregunta. No conozco de ninguna organización en Guinea Ecuatorial que se dedica al trabajo de derechos humanos, por lo tanto no sé quién puede decir eso.
Oh.
Por otro lado, si es la prensa, no hay prensa independiente, y la prensa sé que toma extractos de informes de aquí y de allá y los une y dicen lo que se quiere que diga.
Sorry, would you like to translate?
Yeah, okay. Right. I was saying that I don't know of any organization of human rights working in Equatorial Guinea. I mean, in Equatorial Guinea. Therefore, I don't know who can be disseminating that information. I understood the question to be that the press in Equatorial Guinea says that organizations say that human rights are improving. Given that the press is not independent in Equatorial Guinea, I would doubt the quality of that information, and I think what they do, I know that they do often, they take extracts from one report and another, put it together, and they come up with the answer that the people want to hear there.
En conclusión, I want to take just a second to thank the panelists here. This, to me, has been a very fruitful discussion. You should know that they will be here, most of them. Ken might leave, but he will be here tomorrow, and most of them will be here tomorrow. So this conversation, obviously, can continue. I want to thank Benita San Pedro and all the conference organizers for making this possible. And
He's the moderator.
in closing, and also almost in response to your question, I should say that there is no substitute for an eyewitness. So if you're not happy by what international organizations are already doing in EG, it's up to you to step up to the plate and tell them what is going on. And I'm saying it to you, but I'm saying it really to all Equatorial Guineans. There is more we can do to make sure that what is happening in EG come to light, and to make sure that the successes are also brought to light. So thank you very much for coming to this panel.
Oh.